What would you do if you discovered that the person closest to the throne was hiding a secret so dangerous it could bring down an entire kingdom? In the grand halls of Aldermere Palace, where whispers travel faster than royal decrees and loyalty can be bought with a single glance, one shocking discovery was about to change everything. The Duchess Helena Ashworth had always been the picture of royal perfection, until Prince Alexander found something in her private chambers that would make him question everything he thought he knew about the woman who was supposed to become his stepmother. The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Aldermere Palace like ghostly fingers, unwilling to release their grip on the seat of power that had stood for over 8 centuries. Prince Alexander Thorne walked briskly through the East Wing corridors, his polished boots echoing against the marble floors in a rhythm that matched his troubled thoughts. At 28, he had grown accustomed to the weight of expectation that came with being second in line to the throne, but today felt different. Today, something in the air itself seemed charged with an electric tension that made his skin crawl. The palace staff moved about their morning duties with practiced silence, bowing respectfully as he passed. Alexander nodded in acknowledgement, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying the strange conversation he had overheard the night before. 2 kitchen maids had been whispering about the Duchess Helena, his father's intended bride, saying things that made no sense. They spoke of midnight visitors and hush phone calls that lasted until dawn. When they noticed him approaching, they had scattered like startled birds, leaving him with more questions than answers. Helena Ashworth had entered their lives 18 months ago like a breath of fresh air. She was everything the grieving King Edmund needed after the tragic loss of Queen Isabella. Intelligent, compassionate, and possessed of a grace that seemed to heal the very walls of the palace. The nation had embraced her with open arms, seeing in her the promise of stability and renewal that had been missing since the Queen's death in that terrible car accident 3 years prior. Alexander had initially been skeptical of any woman who might try to replace his beloved mother, but Helena had won him over with her genuine warmth and her obvious devotion to his father. She never tried to mother him or his younger sister, Princess Sophia, instead treating them as the adults they were while still showing the kind of care that had been absent from their lives for too long. The wedding was scheduled for Christmas Eve, just 3 months away, and the entire kingdom was buzzing with excitement. But something had changed in recent weeks. Alexander couldn't put his finger on exactly what it was, but there were small things that didn't add up. Helena would receive phone calls that made her face go pale, and she would excuse herself for hours at a time without explanation. She had started wearing long sleeves, even in warm weather, and more than once, Alexander had noticed her unconsciously rubbing her left wrist, as if it pained her. The most troubling incident had occurred just 5 days earlier. Alexander had been returning late from a charity function when he saw Helena's private car leaving the palace grounds well past midnight. The next morning, when he casually mentioned seeing her car, she had looked genuinely confused and insisted she had been asleep all night. Either she was lying or someone else had been using her vehicle. These thoughts occupied Alexander's mind as he made his way to the blue drawing room, where he was scheduled to review the final security arrangements for an upcoming state dinner. His father's chief of security, Colonel James Rutherford, was a man Alexander had known since childhood, a stern but fair individual who had served the royal family with unwavering loyalty for over 2 decades. "Good morning, Your Highness," Colonel Rutherford said, rising from behind a mahogany desk covered with blueprints and security protocols. His weathered face bore the lines of a man who had seen too much and worried about even more. "I trust you're well." "As well as can be expected, James," Alexander replied, settling into a leather chair across from the desk. "Though I have to admit, I've been having some concerns about security lately." The colonel's eyes sharpened immediately. In his experience, when members of the royal family expressed concerns about security, it was usually for good reason. "What kind of concerns, sir?" Alexander hesitated for a moment, then decided to trust his instincts. "It's about the Duchess. I've noticed some unusual behavior lately, and I'm wondering if you've observed anything that might be cause for concern." Colonel Rutherford leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "I've been meaning to discuss this with you, actually. There have been some irregularities in the security logs regarding the Duchess's movements. Nothing alarming on the surface, but enough to catch my attention." "What kind of irregularities?" "Well, for starters, there are several instances where her security detail reports show her being in her private apartments, while the palace's electronic security system indicates her key card was used to access areas she shouldn't have been visiting. The wine cellars, the old servant quarters, even the tower room that's been sealed off since your great-grandfather's time. Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. The tower room had been closed for decades after a fire had damaged part of the structure. It was considered unsafe, and access was strictly prohibited. Are you suggesting someone else might be using her access card? It's possible, Colonel Rutherford admitted. Or it's possible that the Duchess herself is visiting these areas for reasons she hasn't shared with her security team. Either scenario is troubling from a safety perspective. The two men sat in contemplative silence for a moment before Alexander spoke again. James, I need to ask something of you, and I need you to understand that this request comes from my genuine concern for both the Duchess's safety and the security of the royal family. Of course, Your Highness. What do you need? I want to conduct a discreet inspection of the Duchess's private quarters. Not a search, exactly, but a security review to ensure there are no vulnerabilities that might be putting her or the rest of us at risk. Colonel Rutherford considered this carefully. Such an action would normally require the king's direct authorization, but Alexander's request fell into a gray area of security protocol. As second in line to the throne, he had certain authorities when it came to palace security, especially when potential threats were involved. I can arrange for that, sir. The Duchess is scheduled to accompany your father to the Children's Hospital this afternoon. Her quarters will be unoccupied for approximately 3 hours. Would that timing work? Perfect, Alexander said, though he felt anything but comfortable about what they were planning. I want to emphasize that this must remain completely confidential. If we find nothing suspicious, I don't want the Duchess to ever know this inspection took place. Understood, sir. I'll make the necessary arrangements. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of routine meetings and ceremonial duties, but Alexander found it impossible to concentrate on anything other than the afternoon's planned inspection. He tried to tell himself that he was simply being cautious, that his concerns about Helena were probably unfounded, but something deep in his gut told him otherwise. When the appointed time arrived, Alexander met Colonel Rutherford outside Helena's private suite in the palace's north wing. The Duchess had been given the Queen's former apartments after the engagement was announced, a gesture that had been seen as both appropriate and symbolic of her future role. The rooms were spacious and elegantly appointed, with tall windows overlooking the palace gardens and antique furnishings that spoke of centuries of royal occupancy. The security sweep has already been completed, Colonel Rutherford reported quietly. No electronic surveillance devices or security threats detected. However, there are a few things you should see. They entered the suite through the main sitting room, and immediately Alexander was struck by how lived in the space felt. Helena's personal touches were everywhere. Photographs of her late parents, books stacked on side tables, a half-finished watercolor painting on an easel by the window. It was the room of someone who had truly made this place her home. The first item of interest is in her private office, Colonel Rutherford said, leading Alexander through a connecting door into a smaller room lined with bookshelves. On the desk sat a laptop computer that appeared to be much more sophisticated than the standard palace-issued devices. This is military-grade encryption equipment, the colonel explained, far beyond what would be needed for normal royal correspondence or personal use. The level of security on this device suggests it's being used for highly sensitive communications. Alexander frowned as he examined the computer. Could this be related to her charity work? I know she's been involved with several international humanitarian organizations. Possibly, but that level of encryption is typically reserved for intelligence agencies or high-level diplomatic communications. It's certainly not standard for charitable organizations. They moved on to Helena's bedroom, where Colonel Rutherford pointed out several other anomalies. A second cell phone hidden in a jewelry box, its number not registered with palace security. A small safe built into the wall behind a mirror, which was not part of the room's original design, and had been installed recently without going through proper security protocols. We can't access the safe without the combination, Colonel Rutherford explained, but the fact that it exists and wasn't cleared through security channels is concerning. It was in Helena's dressing room that they made the most disturbing discovery. Hidden behind a panel of evening gowns, Colonel Rutherford found a small metal box that had been carefully concealed beneath the floorboards. Inside the box were items that made both men's blood run cold. There were photographs, dozens of them, showing various members of the royal family in private moments. Pictures of Alexander and Sophia as children, photos of the late Queen Isabella that appeared to have been taken with a telephoto lens, images of King Edmund in his private study. But most disturbing were the recent photographs that showed intimate moments between the king and Helena herself. Pictures that could only have been taken by someone with unprecedented access to the royal family's private life. Beneath the photographs were documents that appeared to be floor plans of the palace, including areas that were not shown on any publicly available blueprints. There were detailed schedules of royal movements, security protocols, and what appeared to be psychological profiles of various family members. "Your Highness," Colonel Rutherford said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I believe we may have a serious security breach on our hands." Alexander felt the world spinning around him as he tried to process what they had discovered. The woman who was supposed to become his stepmother, the woman his father loved and trusted completely, appeared to be conducting some form of surveillance on the royal family. But why? And for whom? "James, we need to think about this very carefully," Alexander said, his mind racing through the implications. "If we're wrong about what this means, we could destroy an innocent woman's life and break my father's heart. But if we're right, sir, then the royal family is in immediate danger." They carefully returned everything to its original position and left Helena's quarters as quietly as they had entered. Back in Colonel Rutherford's office, they spread copies of the most concerning photographs and documents on the desk and tried to make sense of what they had found. The level of detail in these surveillance materials suggests this operation has been going on for years, Colonel Rutherford observed. "Some of these photographs of you and Princess Sophia appear to have been taken when you were teenagers, long before the Duchess entered your father's life." Alexander felt sick as the implications became clear. "You're saying she didn't just happen to meet my father by chance?" "I'm saying this appears to be a long-term intelligence operation, and the Duchess may have been placed specifically to gain access to the royal family. The question is, who is she working for, and what is their ultimate objective?" The two men spent the next several hours analyzing every piece of evidence they had gathered, trying to piece together a puzzle that seemed to grow more complex with every revelation. The sophisticated encryption equipment suggested connections to either foreign intelligence services or criminal organizations with significant resources. The detailed psychological profiles indicated that whoever Helena was working for had a deep understanding of how to manipulate the royal family's emotions and vulnerabilities. As the afternoon sun began to set over the palace grounds, Alexander realized they faced an almost impossible decision. They had evidence that suggested the woman his father planned to marry was involved in some form of espionage or surveillance operation against the royal family. But they still didn't know the full scope of the threat or who else might be involved. "We need to be extremely careful about how we proceed," Alexander said finally. "If Helena is part of a larger network, exposing her prematurely could put the entire family at risk. But we can't allow her to continue having access to sensitive information." Colonel Rutherford nodded grimly. "I recommend we begin discreet surveillance of the Duchess immediately. We need to know who she's communicating with, where she goes when she leaves the palace, and what her true objectives are." "Agreed. But, James, this investigation stays between us for now. I don't want anyone else knowing about this until we have a clearer picture of what we're dealing with." "Understood, sir. I'll assign my most trusted agents to begin surveillance tomorrow." As Alexander made his way back to his own quarters that evening, his mind was spinning with questions and possibilities. How could he face Helena at dinner, knowing what he now knew? How could he watch his father's happiness, knowing it might all be built on lies? And, most troubling of all, if Helena was indeed part of some larger conspiracy, what was their ultimate goal? The palace around him suddenly felt different, less like a home and more like a fortress under siege. Every shadow seemed to hide potential threats. Every familiar face might be hiding secrets. The woman who had brought joy back into his father's life, who had helped heal the wounds left by his mother's death, might be the most dangerous enemy they had ever faced. But even as these dark thoughts consumed him, Alexander realized that he still didn't want to believe it. Part of him desperately hoped that there was some innocent explanation for everything they had found, that Helena truly was the woman she appeared to be. The alternative was too horrible to contemplate. Not just the betrayal of his father's trust, but the possibility that his mother's death might not have been the accident everyone believed it to be. As night fell over Aldermere Palace, Alexander stood at his window looking out over the gardens where he had played as a child, where his mother had taught him about duty and honor, where Helena now walked each morning with his father. Tomorrow would bring new revelations and difficult decisions, but tonight, all he could do was wonder how many other secrets lay hidden in the shadows of the place he had always called home. The following morning brought with it an unseasonably cold wind that rattled the ancient windows of Aldermere Palace, as if nature itself was warning of the storms to come. Alexander had barely slept, his mind replaying the discoveries from Helena's quarters over and over again. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw those photographs, intimate family moments captured by someone they had trusted completely. Breakfast was served in the smaller dining room, where the royal family typically gathered for informal meals. King Edmund sat at the head of the table, his weathered face brightened by the kind of contentment that had been absent for years after Isabella's death. At 55, he was still a handsome man, though grief had added silver to his dark hair and lines around his kind eyes. Helena sat to his right, radiant in a cream-colored blouse that complemented her auburn hair, laughing softly at something Sophia had said about her upcoming art exhibition. Alexander watched them carefully, searching Helena's face for any sign of deception or malice. She appeared completely natural, asking interested questions about Sophia's work and offering gentle suggestions for the exhibition's layout. Her affection for both his father and sister seemed genuine, her concern for their well-being evident in every gesture and word. "Alexander, you're unusually quiet this morning," Helena observed, turning her warm brown eyes toward him. "I hope you're not feeling unwell." "Just thinking about the upcoming state dinner," he replied, forcing a smile. "Security concerns, you know how it is." Helena nodded sympathetically. "I can't imagine how stressful it must be, constantly worrying about everyone's safety. Your father tells me you take your responsibilities very seriously." King Edmund beamed with paternal pride. "Alexander has always been conscientious, perhaps sometimes too much so. I keep telling him that he needs to find time for himself, maybe even find someone special to share his life with." "Father, please," Alexander said, his discomfort evident. The irony of discussing his lack of a romantic life while sitting across from a woman who might be a spy was almost unbearable. "I agree with your father," Helena said gently. "You deserve happiness, Alexander. Life is too short to spend it all worrying about duty and protocol." The sincerity in her voice made Alexander's chest tighten with confusion. Either Helena was the most skilled actress he had ever encountered, or there was something fundamentally wrong with their interpretation of yesterday's discoveries. The woman sitting across from him seemed incapable of the kind of calculated deception that the evidence suggested. After breakfast, Alexander retreated to his private study to meet with Colonel Rutherford. The security chief arrived carrying a thick folder and wearing an expression that suggested the news was not good. "The surveillance we initiated yesterday has already yielded some interesting results," Rutherford began without preamble. "The Duchess left the palace grounds at 11:30 last night, approximately 2 hours after the family dinner ended. She drove to a location in the old quarter of the city and met with someone whose identity we have not yet established." Alexander felt his heart sink. "How long did this meeting last?" "Approximately 45 minutes. Our agents were unable to get close enough to observe the details of the interaction, but they did manage to photograph the individual she met with." Rutherford opened the folder and pulled out several surveillance photographs. The images showed Helena standing in what appeared to be a small park, speaking with a middle-aged man in a dark coat. The photos were taken from a distance, but the body language suggested an intense, serious conversation. "We ran the man's image through various databases," Rutherford continued. "No matches in our criminal records or intelligence files, but that doesn't mean he's not connected to a foreign agency or criminal organization." Alexander studied the photographs carefully. Helena's posture in the images suggested tension, even distress. Her arms were crossed defensively, and in one photo, she appeared to be backing away from the man as if she felt threatened. "James, look at her body language in these photos," Alexander said slowly. "She doesn't look like someone having a friendly meeting with a collaborator. She looks frightened." Colonel Rutherford examined the images again. "You may be right, sir, but that could simply mean she's dealing with handlers who use intimidation as a control mechanism. It's not uncommon in espionage operations. Or it could mean something else entirely," Alexander said, a new possibility beginning to form in his mind. What if Helena isn't a willing participant in whatever this is? What if she's being coerced? Before Rutherford could respond, there was a soft knock on the study door. Alexander quickly gathered the photographs and slipped them back into the folder as his private secretary entered. Your Highness, forgive the interruption, but the Duchess has requested a private meeting with you. She's waiting in the Rose Garden Pavilion. Alexander exchanged a quick glance with Colonel Rutherford. The timing of Helena's request, coming so soon after a midnight meeting, could hardly be coincidental. Tell her I'll be there in 5 minutes, Alexander replied. After the secretary left, Rutherford leaned forward urgently. Sir, this could be an attempt to determine how much you know. I strongly advise against meeting with her alone. I understand your concerns, but I need to hear what she has to say. Position your men discreetly around the garden, but don't interfere unless I signal for help. Alexander made his way through the palace corridors with measured steps, his mind preparing for what could be the most important conversation of his life. The Rose Garden Pavilion was one of his mother's favorite places, a delicate structure of white marble and climbing roses that provided a peaceful retreat from the formality of palace life. Helena was sitting on the curved marble bench inside the pavilion, her hands folded in her lap, and her face turned toward the garden. She looked smaller somehow, more fragile than he had ever seen her before. When she heard his approaching footsteps, she turned, and Alexander was startled to see that her eyes were red with unshed tears. Thank you for coming, Alexander, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I wasn't sure if you would. Of course I came, he replied, settling onto the bench beside her, but maintaining a careful distance. You seemed upset. Is everything all right? Helena was quiet for a long moment, her fingers nervously twisting the engagement ring his father had given her. When she finally spoke, her words were not what Alexander had expected. I need to tell you something about my past, about who I really am. Your father doesn't know, and I've been living in terror that someone would discover the truth and use it to hurt him. Alexander's pulse quickened, but he kept his expression neutral. What kind of truth? My name isn't really Helena Ashworth, she said, the words coming out in a rush as if she had been holding them back for too long. It's Helena Kowalski, and I'm not the daughter of a respectable English family. I'm the daughter of a Polish immigrant who worked in factories his entire life, and a mother who cleaned houses to make ends meet. Alexander blinked in surprise. Of all the revelations he had been preparing himself for, this was not one of them. Helena, is that all? You're concerned about your family's background. You don't understand, she said, tears finally spilling over. It's not just about being embarrassed by my humble origins. I've been lying to everyone, living under a false identity for years. The documents, the family history, the connections to English society, it's all fabricated. Why? Alexander asked gently. Why did you feel the need to create a false identity? Helena stood abruptly and walked to the edge of the pavilion, gripping the marble railing so tightly her knuckles turned white. Because I was running away from something terrible, and I thought if I became someone else, I could finally be safe. What were you running from? The words that came next made Alexander's blood run cold. My first husband, Viktor Kozlov. He's a member of the Russian organized crime syndicate, and he's been hunting me for 5 years. Alexander felt the world shift around him as the pieces of the puzzle began to rearrange themselves into a completely different picture. Helena, are you saying you're in hiding from the Russian mafia? Victor isn't just any criminal, she said, her voice shaking with fear. He's the son of one of the most powerful crime bosses in Eastern Europe. When I married him, I was 19 and naive. I thought I was in love with a successful businessman. I had no idea what his family really did until it was too late. She turned back to face Alexander, and the terror in her eyes was unmistakable. The marriage was a nightmare. Victor was controlling, violent, and paranoid. He used me as a trophy wife to legitimize his business dealings while conducting horrific crimes behind closed doors. When I finally found the courage to leave him 3 years ago, I thought I had escaped forever. But people like that don't just let you walk away. Alexander's mind was racing as he tried to process this new information. The surveillance equipment in your room, the photographs. You found them, Helena said, closing her eyes in despair. I was hoping you wouldn't, but I knew it was probably inevitable. So you know we search your quarters? Helena nodded miserably. Your security team is good, but they're not invisible. I've had to become very good at noticing when I'm being watched. Then know what we found. Helena, those photographs, the palace blueprints, they suggest you've been conducting surveillance on the royal family for years. Because I have been, she said, the admission hanging in the air like a physical blow. But not for the reasons you think. Alexander stood slowly, every muscle in his body tense. Then, explain it to me. Make me understand why someone who claims to love my father has been spying on our family. Helena walked back to the bench and sat down heavily, as if the weight of her secrets was finally too much to bear. 5 years ago, when I first escaped from Victor, I tried to disappear completely. I changed my name, moved to different countries, did everything I could to start a new life. But he has resources that most people can't imagine. He found me 3 times, and each time, I barely escaped with my life. She paused, gathering her courage to continue. The last time he found me, about 2 years ago, I was living quietly in Scotland, working as a translator for international legal firms. His men cornered me in my apartment and gave me an ultimatum. Either I would work for them willingly, or they would kill me and find another way to accomplish their goals. What goals? Alexander asked, though he was beginning to suspect he didn't want to know the answer. Victor's organization has been planning something for years, Helena said. Something involving the British royal family. They needed someone with access, someone who could provide intelligence about security protocols, family schedules, personal weaknesses that could be exploited. Alexander felt sick as the full scope of the threat became clear. So they forced you to target my father. They researched his background, his personality, his vulnerabilities after your mother's death. They crafted an entire false identity for me, designed to appeal specifically to him. The charity work, the interest in art and literature, even my accent. Everything was calculated to make me the perfect companion for a grieving king. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Alexander thought about his father's joy over the past 18 months, the way he had come alive again after years of mourning, and realized it had all been built on a foundation of lies and manipulation. But something changed. Helena continued, her voice growing stronger. I was supposed to gather intelligence for 6 months and then disappear, leaving your father heartbroken but none the wiser about the true purpose of our relationship. But I didn't expect to actually fall in love with him. Alexander studied her face carefully. You're saying your feelings for my father are genuine? I love Edmund more than I've ever loved anyone in my life, Helena said fiercely. He's kind, intelligent, compassionate, everything that Victor and his world are not. And I love you and Sophia too. You become the family I never had, and the thought of betraying that trust make me physically ill. Then, why haven't you told my father the truth? Why continue with the deception? Helena's face crumpled with despair. Because Victor made it clear that if I don't deliver what he's looking for, he'll kill everyone I care about. He has photographs of Edmund at public events, pictures of you and Sophia. He knows your routines, your security arrangements, your weaknesses. If I don't provide him with the intelligence he wants, he'll use what he already knows to hurt your family. Alexander sat back down beside her, his mind working furiously to process this new understanding of their situation. Helena, what exactly is Victor planning? What does he want with intelligence about the royal family? I don't know all the details, she admitted. But from what I've been able to piece together, it involves some kind of operation during the state dinner next month. The one where the Russian president will be attending. Alexander's blood turned to ice. The state dinner she was referring to was one of the most significant diplomatic events of the year. The Russian president's visit had been planned for months as part of ongoing negotiations about energy agreements and trade relationships. Security for the event would be unprecedented, but if someone had inside intelligence about protocols and vulnerabilities, Helena, you have to understand how serious this is. If Victor's organization is planning something during that state dinner, it could be an assassination attempt, a terrorist attack, or worse. We have to contact the authorities immediately. I know, Helena said, tears streaming down her face. I've been trying to figure out a way to warn someone without putting your family in more danger. But Victor is too smart, too connected. He has people inside law enforcement agencies, intelligence services, even private security firms. If word gets back to him that I've betrayed the operation, he'll kill Edmund without hesitation. Alexander reached out and gently took her hand, surprised by how cold it felt despite the warm afternoon sun. Helena, we're going to figure this out. But I need you to tell me everything, every detail about Victor's organization, every piece of intelligence you've been forced to provide, every contact you've had with their operatives. The man I met with last night is my handler, Helena said. His name is Alexei, and he's been pressuring me to provide more detailed information about the state dinner security arrangements. He threatened to hurt Sophia if I don't deliver a complete breakdown of the security protocols by the end of this week. The mention of his sister made Alexander's protective instincts flare with dangerous intensity. That's not going to happen. We're going to stop this, Helena, but I need you to trust me completely. No more secrets, no more lies. Helena squeezed his hand gratefully. There's one more thing you need to know. Last night, when I met with Alexei, he told me that they know about your investigation. Someone inside the palace has been reporting back to them about your activities. Alexander felt as if the ground had dropped out from under him. Are you saying we have another spy inside the palace? I don't know who it is, Helena said, but Alexei knew about your meeting with Colonel Rutherford. He knew about the security review of my quarters. They're watching you just as closely as they've been watching me. The implications were staggering. If Victor's organization had multiple assets inside the palace, then nowhere was safe. Every conversation, every plan, every security arrangement could be compromised. Alexander realized they were dealing with an adversary far more sophisticated and dangerous than he had initially understood. Helena, I need you to do something for me, Alexander said urgently. I need you to continue acting normally, continue meeting with Alexei, but from now on, you're going to be feeding him false information. We're going to turn you into a double agent. Helena's eyes widened with fear. Alexander, if they suspect I'm working against them, they won't suspect anything if we're careful. But we need to identify their other assets inside the palace, and we need to find out exactly what they're planning for the state dinner. You're our only advantage in this situation. Helena was quiet for a long moment, considering the enormity of what he was asking. Finally, she nodded. What do you need me to do? For now, just continue your regular routine. I'm going to speak with Colonel Rutherford about setting up a secure communication system so we can coordinate without being detected. And Helena, yes, thank you for trusting me with the truth. I know how difficult this must have been for you. Helena smiled through her tears. I've been carrying this burden alone for so long. I had almost forgotten what it felt like to have someone I could trust. As they walked back toward the palace together, Alexander's mind was already working through the complex web of deception they would need to weave in order to protect his family and stop Victor's organization. The woman walking beside him was no longer the enemy he had feared she might be, but she wasn't entirely the person he had thought he knew either. She was something far more complex, a victim who had been forced to become a spy, a woman who had found love in the midst of a nightmare, and now potentially their best hope for survival. The palace loomed before them, its ancient walls holding centuries of secrets, but Alexander realized that the current crisis dwarfed anything the royal family had faced in generations. Somewhere within those walls was another spy, someone they trusted who had been reporting their every move to a criminal organization with deadly intentions. As they reached the entrance, Helena paused and turned to him one final time. Alexander, there's something else. Something I haven't told you about your mother's death. Alexander felt his world tilt again. What about my mother? Victor's organization has been watching your family for years, long before I ever met your father. The car accident that killed your mother. I don't think it was an accident at all. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, freezing Alexander's blood in his veins. For a moment, the world around him seemed to stop. The birds fell silent. The wind ceased its movement through the trees. Even his own heartbeat seemed to pause as his mind struggled to process what Helena had just revealed. What did you just say? He whispered, his voice barely audible. Helena's face had gone pale, and she looked as if she immediately regretted her words. Alexander, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. No, he said, gripping her arm with perhaps more force than necessary. You can't say something like that, and then try to take it back. What do you know about my mother's death? Helena glanced nervously toward the palace, as if afraid they might be overheard even in the open garden. We should go somewhere more private. This isn't a conversation we can have here. Alexander's mind was reeling as they made their way back inside the palace. His mother's death had been the defining tragedy of his family's life. Queen Isabella had been returning from a charity event in the countryside when her car had skidded on a wet road and crashed into a stone bridge. The investigation had been thorough, the conclusion definitive, a tragic accident caused by poor weather conditions and excessive speed. But now Helena was suggesting it had been something else entirely. Something deliberate. something connected to the same criminal organization that was now threatening his family's safety. They made their way to Alexander's private study, where he quickly activated the electronic privacy measures that would prevent any surveillance devices from functioning in the room. Only when he was certain they couldn't be overheard did he turn to Helena with barely controlled desperation. "Tell me everything you know about my mother's death." Helena sat down heavily in one of the leather chairs facing his desk, her hands shaking as she folded them in her lap. "I need you to understand that I don't have proof of what I'm about to tell you. This is information I pieced together from overheard conversations and fragments of documents I've seen during my time working for Victor's organization." "I don't care about proof right now," Alexander said. "I need to know what you've learned." Helena took a deep breath before continuing. "Victor's father, Dmitry Kozlov, has been planning what he calls the long game for over a decade. It's not just about criminal enterprises or money laundering. It's about gaining influence over Western governments, particularly the British monarchy, in ways that would give his organization unprecedented power and protection." Alexander began pacing behind his desk, his mind racing to connect the dots. "And you think my mother somehow interfered with these plans?" "Queen Isabella was more politically active than most people realized," Helena said carefully. "Her charity work wasn't just ceremonial. She had been building relationships with international human rights organizations, and she had begun investigating connections between certain Eastern European businesses and organized crime." The revelation hit Alexander like a physical blow. His mother had always been passionate about her charitable causes, but he had never imagined that her work might have put her in danger. "Are you saying she discovered something about the Kozlov organization?" 3 months before her death, Queen Isabella had met with representatives from several anti-trafficking organizations. Helena continued. They had provided her with evidence linking legitimate businesses in London to human trafficking operations run by Russian criminal syndicates. "Your mother was preparing to present this evidence to international law enforcement agencies." Alexander's legs felt weak, and he gripped the back of his chair for support. "And Victor's organization killed her to prevent that from happening?" "The timing was too convenient to be coincidental," Helena said. "Your mother dies in what appears to be an accident. The investigation she was conducting quietly disappears, and the trafficking networks she was trying to expose continued operating without interference. Dmitry Kozlov is not the kind of man who leaves such threats to his empire unaddressed." The room seemed to spin around Alexander as the full implications of Helena's words sank in. His mother hadn't died in a random accident. She had been murdered to protect a criminal organization that was now threatening his family again. The grief that had consumed his father, the trauma that had scarred him, and Sophia, the years of healing they had struggled through, all of it had been caused by deliberate, calculated evil. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" Alexander demanded, anger and anguish warring in his voice. "Because I knew what it would do to you," Helena said, tears streaming down her face. "And because I wasn't certain my suspicions were correct. I've been trying to find concrete proof, but Victor keeps me isolated from most operational details. He doesn't trust me with sensitive information." Alexander slammed his fist down on the desk, causing Helena to flinch. "My family has been living with killers for 5 years, believing my mother died in an accident, while the people responsible for her murder have been planning another attack. Do you have any idea what that does to me?" "I know," Helena sobbed. "I know, and I'm sorry. But, Alexander, if we're going to stop them from hurting anyone else, we need to focus on what we can do now, not what we should have done differently in the past." Alexander forced himself to take several deep breaths, trying to regain control of his emotions. Helena was right. His anger wouldn't bring his mother back or protect his family from future threats. But the rage burning in his chest wasn't something he could simply dismiss. "What kind of evidence would we need to prove Victor's organization was responsible for my mother's death?" he asked. "The kind of evidence that would probably get us all killed if we tried to obtain it," Helena replied honestly. "Victor's father doesn't keep written records of his most sensitive operations. Everything is handled through verbal communications and trusted intermediaries." A soft knock on the study door interrupted their conversation. Alexander quickly composed himself before calling for whoever it was to enter. Colonel Rutherford stepped into the room, his expression grave. "Your Highness, forgive the intrusion, but we have a developing situation that requires your immediate attention." Alexander exchanged a quick glance with Helena before responding. "What kind of situation, James?" We've been monitoring communications related to yesterday's security concerns, and we've intercepted some troubling intelligence. There appears to be a credible threat against Princess Sophia. The words hit Alexander like ice water. His sister was the most innocent member of their family, completely removed from political intrigue and palace security concerns. The idea that someone would target her was almost incomprehensible. What kind of threat? He demanded. Colonel Rutherford glanced uncertainly at Helena before responding. Sir, this information is highly classified. Perhaps we should discuss it privately. The Duchess has my complete trust, Alexander said firmly. You can speak freely in her presence. Helena looked surprised by his declaration of trust, given everything they had just discussed, but she remained silent as Colonel Rutherford continued. Our intelligence suggests that hostile operatives are planning to abduct Princess Sophia during her art exhibition opening tomorrow evening. The event is public, security will be minimal, and there will be numerous opportunities for someone to approach her without arousing suspicion. Alexander felt his world tilting again. First, the revelation about his mother's murder. Now, a threat against Sophia. The attacks on his family were escalating rapidly. Do we know who's behind this threat? He asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The intelligence is fragmentary, but it appears to be connected to the same Eastern European criminal network we've been investigating. Helena had gone completely white, and Alexander realized she understood the implications better than anyone. Victor's organization was moving from surveillance and intelligence gathering to direct action. The state dinner was still weeks away, but they were no longer willing to wait for their long-term plans to develop. James, I need you to increase security around Sophia immediately, Alexander ordered. Cancel the art exhibition if necessary. Sir, with respect, canceling the exhibition would only delay the threat, not eliminate it. And it might alert the hostile operatives that we're aware of their plans. Alexander realized Colonel Rutherford was right, but the thought of allowing his sister to remain vulnerable was unbearable. Then, what do you recommend? We proceed with the exhibition as planned, but we turn it into a controlled environment. We flood the area with plainclothes security personnel, we monitor every entrance and exit, and we use the event as an opportunity to identify and capture the hostile operatives. Helena suddenly spoke up. There's another option, one that might be safer for Princess Sophia. Both men turned to look at her expectantly. I know how Victor's organization operates, she continued. They don't typically resort to violent kidnappings unless they believe their primary objectives are threatened. The threat against Princess Sophia is probably a pressure tactic, a way to force Alexander's compliance with their demands. What demands? Colonel Rutherford asked. Helena looked at Alexander before responding. They want detailed security information about the upcoming state dinner. If they believe they're going to get that information through other means, they might abandon their plans to target Princess Sophia. Alexander understood immediately what she was suggesting. You want to give them false information to protect Sophia. Not just false information, Helena said. Convincing false information that would actually help us identify their other assets inside the palace. Colonel Rutherford frowned. Your Highness, using the Duchess as a double agent would be extremely dangerous. If her handlers suspect deception, they'll kill her, Alexander finished. I understand the risks, James, but right now, it might be our best option for protecting Sophia while gathering intelligence about their operation. The three of them spent the next several hours developing a complex plan that would require precise timing and considerable luck to succeed. Helena would meet with her handler, Alexei, and provide him with what appeared to be legitimate intelligence about the state dinner security arrangements. However, the information would be carefully crafted to serve their purposes rather than Victor's organization. The false intelligence would include details about security personnel assignments, communication protocols, and vulnerability assessments that would seem valuable, but would actually lead Victor's operatives into carefully prepared traps. More importantly, the information would be distributed through different channels within the palace, allowing them to identify which staff members were reporting back to the criminal organization. The most dangerous part of this plan, Colonel Rutherford warned, is that we'll need to make the false intelligence convincing enough to satisfy sophisticated criminals, while still maintaining the actual security of the state dinner. And if they discover we're feeding them false information, Helena added quietly, they won't just kill me. They'll come after Edmund and both of his children with everything they have. Alexander looked at the woman who had become such a complex figure in his family's life, part victim, part spy, part potential savior. The hatred he had felt toward her just 24 hours earlier had been replaced by something much more complicated. She was still responsible for betraying his family's trust, but she was also their best hope for survival. Helena, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Of course. Do you believe Victor's organization was responsible for my mother's death? Helena was quiet for a long moment before responding. Yes, I do. And I believe that if we don't stop them now, your father will be next. The words hit Alexander like a physical blow, but they also crystallized his resolve. His mother had died trying to expose these criminals, and now they were threatening the rest of his family. He wouldn't allow them to succeed. Then, we proceed with the plan, he said firmly. James, I want you to coordinate with your most trusted agents to prepare for the exhibition tomorrow night. We'll use it as an opportunity to gather intelligence while protecting Sophia. And Helena? Yes. Tomorrow night, when you meet with Alexei to provide the false intelligence, you'll be wearing a wire. We need to record everything, not just for evidence, but so we understand exactly what we're dealing with. Helena nodded, though her face showed clear fear about what they were asking her to do. I understand. But, Alexander, there's something else you need to know about Victor's organization. What now? They don't just kill people who betray them. They destroy everything those people care about first. If this plan goes wrong, they won't just target our family. They'll go after everyone we love, everyone who's ever helped us, everyone who even knows our names. Alexander felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. The decisions he made over the next few days wouldn't just determine his own fate or even his family's survival. They could affect dozens of innocent people who had the misfortune of being connected to the royal family. But as he looked out the window of his study at the gardens where his mother used to walk, where she had taught him about duty and sacrifice, he knew he had no choice. The criminals who had killed Queen Isabella were planning to strike again, and this time, they would be ready for them. James, I want you to reach out to your contacts in international intelligence agencies, Alexander said. If Victor's organization is as powerful as Helena suggests, we're going to need help from outside the palace to stop them. Sir, involving foreign intelligence services could compromise the security of the royal family in other ways. And not involving them could get us all killed, Alexander replied. We're dealing with an enemy that has resources and connections we can't match on our own. Pride and protocol won't protect us if we're dead. Colonel Rutherford nodded reluctantly. I'll make some discreet inquiries. As the afternoon sun began to set over Aldermere Palace, Alexander realized that everything in his life had changed irrevocably in the space of just 2 days. The woman he had suspected of being a spy was actually a victim of the same criminals who had murdered his mother. The peaceful existence he had known was revealed to be nothing more than a temporary illusion. And tomorrow night, his sister's life would depend on their ability to outmaneuver an organization that had been planning their destruction for years. He thought about his father, probably in his private office at that very moment, going over state papers and planning his future with Helena, completely unaware that the woman he loved was fighting a secret war to protect him. Alexander wondered if he should tell his father the truth about Helena's past and the threats they were facing, but he realized that knowledge would only put the king in more danger. For now, the burden of protecting the royal family rested on Alexander's shoulders, aided by a reluctant spy, and a security chief was beginning to understand that they were facing an enemy unlike anything they had ever encountered before. As darkness fell over the palace grounds, Alexander made a silent promise to his mother's memory. The criminals who had killed her would not claim any more victims from his family. Whatever it cost, whatever risks he had to take, he would ensure that Queen Isabella's murderers finally faced justice. But first, they had to survive the next 48 hours. The next evening arrived with an unseasonable storm that seemed to mirror the chaos brewing beneath the surface of royal life. Princess Sophia's art exhibition was scheduled to open at 7 o'clock at the prestigious Whitmore Gallery in central London, and despite the weather, early arrivals were already gathering under umbrellas and fashionable raincoats. Alexander stood in his private quarters, adjusting his dinner jacket while his mind raced through the evening's carefully orchestrated plan. Every detail had been rehearsed, every contingency considered, but he knew that no amount of preparation could account for all the variables they would face when dealing with Victor's criminal organization. Colonel Rutherford entered the room carrying a small electronic device that looked like an ordinary cufflink. "The transmitter is ready," Your Highness. It has a range of approximately 2 miles and will record everything Helena says or hears during her meeting with Alexei. Alexander attached the device to his jacket, its weight barely noticeable but psychologically enormous. Tonight, he would be listening in real time as Helena put her life at risk to gather intelligence about the threats facing his family. The security arrangements for the gallery have been finalized, Rutherford continued. We have 37 plainclothes agents positioned throughout the area, including inside the gallery, in surrounding buildings, and monitoring all access points. Princess Sophia will never be more than 10 feet away from at least 3 trained operatives. And if something goes wrong, we have emergency extraction protocols in place. The princess can be removed from the gallery and transported to a secure location within 90 seconds if necessary. Alexander nodded, though his stomach remained knotted with anxiety. Sophia had no idea that her art exhibition had become the center of an intelligence operation. As far as she knew, this was simply the culmination of months of work preparing for her first major solo show. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Helena entered, wearing an elegant black evening gown that would have been perfectly appropriate for a royal art opening, except for the nearly invisible wire that ran along her neckline to the tiny microphone hidden in her jewelry. The technical team has tested all the equipment, she said quietly. Everything is functioning properly. Alexander studied her face, looking for signs of fear or hesitation. But Helena appeared remarkably calm, considering what she was about to do. Are you ready for this? As ready as I can be, she replied. Alexei expects to meet me at 9:30 after the main reception has ended and most of the crowd has dispersed. That should give us time to identify any hostile operatives who might be watching the gallery during the exhibition. King Edmund appeared in the doorway, resplendent in his formal evening wear and beaming with paternal pride. Are you two ready to go? I can't wait to see Sophia's work displayed properly for the first time. Alexander felt a stab of guilt as he looked at his father's happy face. Edmund had no idea that his daughter was in danger, that his fiancée was a reluctant spy, or that his family was being hunted by the same criminals who had killed his wife. The innocence in his expression was both heartbreaking and something Alexander was determined to preserve for as long as possible. We're ready, Father, Alexander said, offering Helena his arm in a gesture that would appear natural to any observers, but also allowed him to provide her with physical support if she needed it. The drive to the Whitmore Gallery took nearly 40 minutes through London's rain-soaked streets. Alexander spent the time reviewing the evening's timeline with Helena, while his father chatted enthusiastically about Sophia's artistic development and the importance of supporting young artists. The gallery itself was an elegant Georgian building that had been converted into one of London's most prestigious exhibition spaces. As their motorcade pulled up to the entrance, Alexander could see that despite the weather, a considerable crowd had gathered to attend Princess Sophia's opening night. Inside, the gallery had been transformed into a showcase for Sophia's paintings, mostly landscapes and portraits that demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of light and composition that impressed even Alexander, who knew little about art. Sophia moved through the crowd with natural grace, discussing her work with visitors and accepting compliments with the kind of modest confidence that made Alexander proud to be her brother. But even as he smiled and made polite conversation with gallery patrons, Alexander's attention was focused on identifying potential threats in the crowd. Colonel Rutherford had briefed him on what to look for. Individuals who seemed more interested in observing the royal family than viewing the artwork, people who maintained unusual positions near exits or security stations, anyone whose behavior seemed inconsistent with the social nature of the event. For the first hour, everything appeared normal. The guests were exactly the sort of people one would expect at a royal art opening. Wealthy art collectors, museum curators, society figures, and cultural enthusiasts. Alexander began to hope that perhaps the intelligence about threats to Sophia had been inaccurate or that the presence of obvious security had deterred any hostile operatives. Then, at 8:15, Helena discreetly touched his arm and nodded toward a man standing near the gallery's rear entrance. To casual observers, he would have appeared to be just another well-dressed patron, but Alexander immediately recognized him from the surveillance photographs. It was Alexei, Helena's handler. The fact that Alexei had arrived more than an hour before his scheduled meeting with Helena suggested that Victor's organization was conducting their own surveillance of the event. Alexander felt his pulse quicken as he realized they were now in active engagement with the enemy. "He's watching Sophia," Helena whispered, her voice barely audible above the conversations around them. Alexander followed her gaze and saw that she was right. Alexei's attention was focused entirely on Princess Sophia, tracking her movements around the gallery with the kind of professional intensity that made Alexander's protective instincts flare dangerously. Through his hidden earpiece, Alexander heard Colonel Rutherford's voice providing updates from the security command center they had established in a building across the street. "We have visual confirmation of the primary target. Teams 2 and 5 are repositioning to maintain observation." Alexander moved closer to his sister, positioning himself between her and Alexei while maintaining the appearance of casual family support. Sophia was in animated conversation with an elderly art critic, completely unaware of the dangers surrounding her. "Alexander, you seem tense," she observed during a brief lull in the conversation. "Is everything all right?" "Just the usual security concerns," he replied with a smile he hoped appeared more relaxed than he felt. "You know how cautious James can be about public events." Sophia laughed and squeezed his arm affectionately. "You and James worry too much. What could possibly happen at an art exhibition?" Before Alexander could respond, his earpiece crackled with an urgent update from Colonel Rutherford. "We have movement from multiple suspects. At least 3 individuals are converging on the gallery's main floor. All units prepare for possible hostile action." Alexander's blood turned to ice as he scanned the crowd, trying to identify the new threats. Helena had moved to a position where she could observe both Alexei and the main entrance, and the tension in her posture told him that she too had noticed the change in the situation. Through the elegant crowd of art patrons, Alexander began to spot them, men and women who moved with the kind of practice coordination that indicated professional training. They were dressed appropriately for the event, their behavior was outwardly normal, but their positioning created a subtle perimeter around Princess Sophia that would allow them to control her movement through the gallery. "Helena," Alexander said quietly, "we need to move Sophia to the back room. Now." But even as he spoke, he realized that the hostile operatives had anticipated this possibility. One of them, a woman in an expensive red dress, had positioned herself directly between Sophia and the gallery's rear exit. Another man was blocking access to the main staircase that led to the upper level. Alexander's mind raced as he considered their options. They could try to fight their way through the operatives, but that would put innocent gallery patrons at risk and could result in Sophia being injured in the confrontation. They could attempt to call for immediate extraction, but the time it would take for backup to arrive might be too long. Then, Helena did something that surprised everyone, including Alexander. She walked directly toward Alexei, her posture confident and purposeful. "Mr. Peterson," she said in a voice loud enough to be heard by nearby patrons, using what Alexander assumed was Alexei's cover identity. "How wonderful to see you here. I didn't know you were interested in contemporary art." Alexei looked genuinely surprised by Helena's direct approach, clearly not having expected her to acknowledge him publicly. "Duchess Ashworth," he replied carefully. "I was in the neighborhood and thought I might stop by to see the princess's work." "How thoughtful," Helena continued, moving closer to him with the kind of social confidence that came naturally to someone who had been trained to manipulate people through conversation. "I was just about to give some friends a private tour of the princess's studio space upstairs. Perhaps you'd like to join us." Alexander understood immediately what Helena was doing. By publicly inviting Alexei to join a private tour, she was forcing him to either accept and potentially compromise his operation or decline and risk appearing rude in front of witnesses. More importantly, she was creating an opportunity to move the confrontation away from the main gallery floor where Sophia and innocent bystanders could be caught in the middle. Alexei hesitated for a moment, clearly weighing his options. Alexander could see the man's eyes quickly surveying the room, probably communicating with his team through hidden earpieces or subtle hand signals. "That sounds delightful," Alexei finally replied, his smile not reaching his eyes. "I would be honored to join such a distinguished group." Helena turned to Alexander with a bright smile that masked the deadly seriousness of what they were attempting. "Your Highness, would you mind terribly if we borrowed the studio space for a few minutes? I promised Mr. Peterson and his colleagues that they might have a chance to see some of the princess's preliminary sketches." The mention of colleagues confirmed Alexander's suspicion that Alexei's team was prepared to follow them wherever they went. But, at least by moving the confrontation upstairs, they would be able to better control the environment and protect the innocent people in the main gallery. Of course, Alexander replied, playing his part in Helena's improvised performance. Sophia, would you mind showing our guests some of your preparatory work? Princess Sophia looked pleased by the request, completely unaware that she was being moved to safety rather than participating in a routine social interaction. I'd be delighted. The lighting upstairs is much better for viewing detailed work anyway. As they made their way toward the staircase, Alexander noticed that several of the suspicious individuals Helena had identified were indeed following their group. Colonel Rutherford's voice crackled in his earpiece with updates on the movement of hostile operatives, but Alexander forced himself to maintain a calm, social demeanor as they climbed to the gallery's upper level. The studio space was smaller than the main gallery, with large windows that provided excellent natural light during daytime hours, but were now dark mirrors reflecting the room's interior. Alexander immediately noticed that the space had only one entrance, which could be either an advantage or a trap, depending on how the next few minutes unfolded. Sophia began enthusiastically explaining her artistic process to the small group that had joined them, unaware that several of her interested patrons were actually criminals who had been planning to kidnap her just minutes earlier. Alexander positioned himself where he could observe both the room's entrance and the windows, while Helena moved to a spot that would allow her to signal him if she detected any immediate threats. Alexei appeared to be genuinely listening to Sophia's explanation of her painting techniques, but Alexander noticed that his attention was primarily focused on cataloging the room's layout and security vulnerabilities. The man was clearly a professional, gathering intelligence, even while maintaining his cover as an art enthusiast. After several minutes of discussion about artistic technique, Helena smoothly transitioned the conversation to a topic that would allow her to begin gathering the intelligence they needed. Mr. Peterson, you mentioned earlier that you have some experience with security consulting, she said, referring to what must have been part of his cover story. I'm always curious about how professionals assess the safety of public venues like this gallery. Alexei's eyes sharpened slightly, recognizing that Helena was steering the conversation toward more sensitive topics. Security is indeed one of my areas of expertise, he replied carefully. I noticed this venue has several interesting architectural features that present both opportunities and challenges from a protection standpoint. What followed was a subtle but intense conversation about security vulnerabilities, escape routes, and protective protocols that would have sounded like academic discussion to anyone not familiar with the underlying context. But Alexander realized that Helena was skillfully extracting information about Victor's organization's assessment of the gallery's security while appearing to simply make polite conversation. Through his earpiece, he could hear Colonel Rutherford and his team coordinating their response to the situation. Additional security personnel were being positioned around the building, escape routes were being secured, and preparations were being made for whatever confrontation might be about to unfold. Then, at precisely 9:15, Alexei's demeanor changed subtly, but unmistakably. Alexander saw the man's hand move toward his jacket pocket in a gesture that could have been innocent, but set off every alarm bell in his security training. I think perhaps it's time for us to conclude our little tour, Alexei said, his voice maintaining its polite tone while his eyes hardened with unmistakable threat. Duchess, I believe we have some business to discuss privately. Helena's face remained composed, but Alexander could see the fear in her eyes as she realized that the careful game they had been playing was about to become much more dangerous. Of course, she replied smoothly. Princess Sophia, thank you so much for sharing your work with us. It's been absolutely fascinating. But as Helena moved toward the door, one of Alexei's companions, a woman who had been pretending to examine Sophia's paintings, suddenly stepped in front of Princess Sophia with a smile that didn't hide the menace in her eyes. Actually, the woman said, I think Princess Sophia should join us for this conversation. There are some things about her family that she really ought to know. Alexander felt his world narrow to a single point of focus as he realized that despite all their careful planning, Victor's organization had outmaneuvered them. They weren't just here to pressure Helena for information. They were prepared to take Sophia hostage to ensure their demands were met. The next few seconds would determine whether their careful intelligence operation turned into a rescue mission, a hostage situation, or something even worse. Possibility racing through his mind with crystalline clarity. The woman blocking Sophia's path was positioned perfectly to grab his sister if anyone made a sudden move, while Alexei and at least two other operatives had positioned themselves to control the room's single exit. Princess Sophia stood frozen in confusion, finally beginning to understand that something was terribly wrong. "I'm sorry," Sophia said, her voice small and uncertain. "I don't understand what's happening here." Alexander's protective instinct screamed at him to act, to throw himself between his sister and the threats surrounding her, but years of security training held him back. One wrong move could turn a tense confrontation into a deadly hostage situation. "There's no need for anyone to be afraid," Alexei said, his voice maintaining its polite tone while his eyes remained cold as winter steel. "We simply need to have a frank discussion about certain business arrangements, and it's important that all interested parties are present." Helena stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "Mr. Peterson, Princess Sophia has nothing to do with any business arrangements. This is between you and me." "I'm afraid that's no longer true, Duchess," the woman near Sophia replied. "Circumstances have changed, and our employer has decided that a more direct approach is necessary." Through his hidden earpiece, Alexander could hear Colonel Rutherford's team positioning themselves around the building, but he knew that any rescue attempt would be complicated by the presence of innocent gallery patrons on the floor below. The operatives had chosen their moment perfectly, creating a situation where the royal family's own security protocols worked against them. "What do you want?" Alexander asked, his voice steady despite the rage burning in his chest. Alexei smiled, but there was no warmth in his expression. "Your Highness, we want exactly what we've always wanted: cooperation. The Duchess has been providing us with certain information, but recent events suggest that she may not be entirely trustworthy." Helena's face went white as she realized that Victor's organization had discovered her betrayal. "I don't know what you mean." "Don't you?" the woman near Sophia asked, producing a small electronic device from her purse. "We've been monitoring your communications, Duchess. We know about your conversation with Prince Alexander yesterday. We know about the security arrangements being made for tonight, and we know that you've been working with palace security to feed us false information." Alexander felt his heart sink as the full scope of their failure became clear. Not only had Victor's organization penetrated palace security deeply enough to monitor their private conversations, but they had been playing along with the deception operation while planning their own countermove. "The question now," Alexei continued, "is whether the royal family is prepared to be more accommodating in their business arrangements, or whether we need to provide additional motivation for their cooperation." "What kind of motivation?" Alexander asked, though he dreaded the answer. The woman near Sophia moved closer to the princess, close enough that any sudden action would put Sophia in immediate physical danger. "The kind that ensures everyone understands how serious we are about our business relationships." Princess Sophia, finally, found her voice, though it trembled with fear and confusion. "Alexander, what are they talking about? What business arrangements?" Before Alexander could respond, Helena spoke with a strength that surprised everyone in the room. "They're talking about the fact that I've been forced to spy on your family for the past 18 months. They're talking about the fact that they killed your mother to protect their criminal empire. And they're talking about the fact that they'll kill all of us if we don't give them what they want." The words hung in the air like explosions, their impact visible on every face in the room. Sophia staggered backward as if physically struck, while Alexei's expression shifted from confident control to dangerous anger. "Helena, you stupid woman," he snarled, dropping all pretense of politeness. "You've just signed your death warrant." "Maybe," Helena replied, but her voice remained steady. "But at least now everyone knows exactly who they're dealing with." Alexander realized that Helena's decision to reveal the truth, while potentially catastrophic, had also created an opportunity. The operatives were no longer playing a careful game of deception. They were now operating in crisis mode, which meant they might make mistakes. "Sophia, listen to me very carefully," Alexander said, his voice calm and authoritative. "I need you to move very slowly toward the corner of the room, away from the windows." But even as he spoke, Alexander became aware of new sounds from elsewhere in the building. Footsteps in the stairwell, voices speaking in urgent tones, the subtle sounds of people moving with tactical purpose. Colonel Rutherford's team was making their approach, but the timing would be critical. Alexei heard the sounds too, and his demeanor shifted from threatening to desperate. "It seems your security friends have decided to be proactive," he said, reaching inside his jacket to produce a small but deadly-looking pistol. That was a mistake. The appearance of the weapon changed everything. Would have been a tense, but manageable situation suddenly became an immediate threat to everyone's life. Alexander knew that Colonel Rutherford's team would have to assume the worst and respond accordingly, which meant the next few minutes could turn into a firefight in a confined space. "There's no need for weapons," Alexander said, raising his hands in a gesture of non-aggression while positioning himself to shield Sophia from potential gunfire. "We can discuss this rationally." "The time for discussion has passed," Alexei replied. "Your family has been uncooperative, and our patience has limits." But Helena suddenly did something that no one expected. She began laughing. Not hysterical laughter born of fear, but genuine amusement that seemed completely inappropriate for the situation. "Alexei, you really don't understand what you've gotten yourself into, do you?" she said, shaking her head with apparent amazement. "What are you talking about? You think a hunter's here, but you've actually walked into a trap. Do you really believe that Alexander and Colonel Rutherford would have allowed this situation to develop without having contingency plans?" Alexander realized what Helena was doing. She was attempting to shake Alexei's confidence by suggesting that they had been outmaneuvered, even though they were clearly at a tactical disadvantage. It was a dangerous bluff, but it might create enough confusion to give them an opportunity. "Every word we've spoken tonight has been recorded and transmitted to intelligence agencies in 3 different countries," Helena continued, her voice growing stronger with conviction. "Your faces have been photographed by hidden surveillance equipment. Your organization's operational methods have been documented, and, right now, law enforcement agencies are raiding Victor's business operations across Europe." Alexei's eyes narrowed as he tried to determine whether Helena was telling the truth or simply trying to manipulate him. The uncertainty was visible in his expression, and Alexander realized that even professional criminals could be vulnerable to psychological warfare. Then, from the stairwell outside the studio, came the sound they had all been waiting for. Colonel Rutherford's voice speaking through a megaphone. "This is Royal Protection Services. The building is surrounded. Release all hostages and exit the room with your hands visible." The announcement seemed to galvanize everyone in the room. "Alex,